Hello, and welcome to Chaotic Insights, where I break down the TV show Chaotic, and sometimes the TV show isn't the only thing that's chaotic. So, today we'll be talking about episode 21, Out in the Cold. Grab a snack, start your laundry, and we'll dive right in. So, episode summary: Kaz is trying to scan Bluegon in the crystal range, but a crystal starts to fall. Bluegon saves Kaz from that crystal. Then, out of the blue, Perithion traps Bluegon and accredits the opportunity to Kaz. Bluegon tells Kaz he was on his way to give Rymusa a Mujic at the top of Scimitar Summit to help ward off Perithion. Kaz takes up the task, but in order to make it in time, he has to take a dangerous shortcut through Kurtuk Pass. So Peyton, Tom, and Sarah find a player with a scan of Kurtuk Pass and challenge him. So Tom scopes out the dangers of the shortcut in the Drome, while Peyton and Sarah guide Kaz through those dangers. In the end, this plan works, and Kaz is able to give Rymusa the Mujic, and Rymusa wards off Perithion. Yay! Analysis. So, I actually kind of love this episode. I love the way the plot is set up. I think it's really strong. And let me tell you why. I think it's really strong because it incorporates the already established circumstances of the world in a way that follows and reinforces the rules of this world and makes the situation necessary to unfurl in the way that it does. And so let me unpack that a little bit. So, for example, it incorporates Chaotic, Param, and the Dromes simultaneously, which are all already established, right? All have their own rules. And they do it while sticking to and like reinforcing the rules that already exist. They know the rules of their world and like they're writing a story according to that. Plus, they're sticking to already established lore about scanners, and you know how I love a scanner. But like they call Kaz and Tom in like a real live action game of telephone. It's like you know how they're making movies about games now? This is the game of telephone, but like as a movie. But it works. Like the thing is it works. And let me tell you why it works. Because in the last episode, we established that people can port with param objects, right? But in this episode, we ask the question, how can we throw a wrench into that? Sure, we can port with param objects now, it's confirmed and canon, but how do we make a story that that's not just the fix, right? How do we make a story where porting with a param object isn't the solution? And so they like immediately follow up that episode where we can port with param objects now, and that's really useful and clever the way that the param creatures say, how can we fix this? We get help from a chaotic player because a chaotic player has abilities that we don't, right? That's clever in that story. But this story is clever because it immediately justifies why that can't be a solution for everything. And so, how is porting with param objects not your solution? Well, you can not have a scan, right? And so, how do you port to where you don't have a scan to? Right? In the last episode, Tom was like, I'm so lucky Peyton had a scan of the Callstone Sanctuary. But in this episode, Kaz is not so lucky, right? The friends don't have a scan already, and they try to acquire a scan but fail. Complication. And so then they pivot to the next best thing. They find somebody with a scan, but they can't just like casually explore this location in the Betadrome because they don't have the scan, they can't do it casually. So this forces their hand into playing into the competition, the competitive nature, the competitive culture of chaotic. And so it's normal to have a battle, right? And so this forces their hand into playing a competitive battle to scope out the location. And like all of these factors and obstacles are necessary in order for this story to use this plot. All of them justify this plot so well. And I think that's what makes this episode, it's just so uniquely chaotic in a way that like no other show could make an episode with this concept because other shows don't have the same premise as chaotic, right? They don't have the layers of Param, the drome, chaotic, connected through scanners, right? And they don't have the existing lore that like requires this to be necessary. This plot can only happen in a chaotic episode, and I think that's beautiful. Like, I think leaning into what makes this show special makes it special, you know? And I think that's what this episode does, is it leans in. How can we make the most chaotic episode of chaotic? And I don't mean chaotic adjective, I mean chaotic capital C. How do we make the most chaotic version of chaotic? So, this episode, I just have to give it its props. And this is another Kaz focused episode. I would say Kaz has the A plot, and like Tom shares the B plot with the group, like the game of telephone. Yet the B plot directly supports the A plot in a way that makes this episode feel very focused. It's very centralized, and there's not a lot of fluff in this episode. It all directly contributes to the task at hand, which is getting Kaz through the pass so that he can save Rhaemusa. Everything we see directly contributes to that, which I love. I love it's clear, it's concise, it's succinct, it's, it's a plot that matters. It's a plot that has forward motion. It doesn't linger, it just drives forward. And that's a way that this episode really captures your attention, is because it keeps moving. Now, one thing about this episode that intrigues me that was brought up into this episode was the idea of preservation. And this is me digging a little into it, right? But this is the analysis section. So Sarah asks Elliot something to the extent of, "Did you miss the part where our friend is trying to save Rhaemusa's life?" And Elliot doesn't really seem to care. And that brings to me this idea of preservation that seems to be a core value of our four main characters, and they all kind of share that value. Maybe that's why they're friends. But they all care about Param, and they don't want to see any creatures disappear, so to speak. They are active members in Param throughout the series so far, like helping Maxor, helping Mesmar, helping Rhaemusa, right? These are just examples of them like meddling in Param, but for the benefit of Param. Even Kaz like helps Kaor against Von Blut. And so like they are they are active members in not the chaotic community, but in Param. And they don't stand on the sidelines letting events just play out. Like they're these active participants. And that leads me to ask, is there some ideological divide at chaotic that are like interventionalists versus isolationists? Because it seems like some humans just don't care, right? It's not their business, or they're scared of Param. Like, they don't want to touch Param. However, the events unfurl, they'll just let it happen, right? Them as chaotic players are just spectators in this world. That sometimes they go in, grab a scan, but they're a take nothing but pictures, leave nothing but footprints kind of person, right? They're just there to go into chaotic, grab a scan, come back, play the game. Whereas our main characters are these interventionalists. Maxor needs help. I'm going to help him. I can directly affect people's lives in Param and maybe make them better, right? Tom helping Maxor made Maxor's life better. Now, did it make Von Blut's life worse? Who's to say? That's relative. But they are these active participants. And so our main characters do care. They find it important, and they find it important to actively help, right? And they're not malicious. Like, say, Christella and Clay are the other side of this coin. They are interventionalist, but not in a good-faithed way. They intervene, but not for like preservation or goodwill's sake, but for their own benefit. But they still believe that they can intervene. So they're kind of interventionalists for their own benefit kind of way, whereas our main characters are interventionalists in a way to like preserve these creatures, preserve the environment kind of way. Now, a major theme throughout this series is like building empathies for creatures in Param. Their life in Param is not a game for them. It's a game for the people, for the humans, but for the creatures in Param, this is their real life. It has real consequences, and we have to gain empathy for them that you can't just like intervene and mess everything up for them because that's their real life. And so it's interesting how maybe different characters would take interest in that theme. Like it's their real life, so we shouldn't get involved, right? Like this is creatures' real lives, so we shouldn't get involved. Like we shouldn't impact it. Or this is their real life, so we should help them and like make their burdens less burdenful. But it's much easier to do nothing than it is to do something, right? Than it is to help. And so I think maybe that's why our protagonists are at the core of like interventionalists for good, is because they're getting over the barrier of entry of it's easy to do nothing, it's hard to do something to help, but they choose to help. And so I just find it an interesting little thread that it's not really the point of this episode. Like, we get this theme probably more later, but it's just an element that's being laid, and I think pulling that thread and seeing it unravel, right? This might be an interesting lens to view future episodes through. And I don't know, I just got the tingles. Like, that's so exciting. Like, we can watch the show through this lens, and maybe that'll make it more interesting and rewarding for us as an audience. I don't know. It's just something I noticed, and it's interesting, you know, how people are different, characters are different. And so this Elliot kid, he doesn't want to get involved. He's just in the scan business, whereas our main characters maybe want more than that. Now, of course, we know Kaz intervenes, like in this plot specifically, because he feels guilt for getting Blugon trapped. Perithion shows up and is like, haha, Kaz, it's like, thank you so much. It's all your fault that Blugon can no longer help Rymusa. And so now Kaz takes that personally of like, oh, it is my fault. I should help. But he helps nonetheless. And he's able to save Rymusa at the end of the day. Right now, the button on this episode is a moment where Kaz and Rymusa are like, should we go back and free Blugon? And then Kaz is like, I know a shortcut. And that's like the end of the show. You know, that's their like comedic button, like, haha, this was a funny episode, maybe. This isn't the most comedic episode, but they like to end on a light note. And so he's like, I know a shortcut. And that's like making light of this dangerous journey that he just went on. But we never actually go back and see them free Blugon. We don't see him get freed. We don't see him like feel relief. They just cut the scene there. Kaz saves Remusa, and then they're like, end of episode. And I think, well, let me ask you this question. So here's a question. Do you think seeing Blugon be freed from that like cage would complete an arc? And or do you think it would have benefited this episode? We already have a tight 22-minute episode, but do you think, you know, maybe we could have cut one of the obstacles and we could have seen them go back and like save Blugon from that cage. Do you think it would have helped? This makes me think of there's like writing advice that goes, you know, start your scene as late as you can and end it as early as you can. And I think that's what the writers Like, it's exactly what the writers chose to do for this episode. They ended the episode as early as they could because this episode is more about Kaz's journey, about, he was on a scan quest, feels guilty. How does he, how does he help Ramusa to free himself from that guilt to some extent? But also, he feels determined to help Ramusa, right? And so his arc of helping Ramusa completes that journey of, he messed it up and now he fixed it, right? He made a mistake and now he fixed his mistake. End of episode, right? We can cut it there, let the credits roll. Whereas, you know, if we went back to see Bluegon, that's more of like a Bluegon arc. And is a Bluegon arc necessary in this episode? Probably not. But it's interesting that this decision really centers and focuses in on Kaz as the main character of this episode so specifically because he's the one we start the episode with, he's the one we end the episode with. And I think the episode with him on this moment like weeds out anything superfluous or unnecessary. Like the writers deciding that seeing Bluegon like go on his merry way was unnecessary keeps that plot like trim and lean and tight and driven. And so like good for them, right? They followed that writing advice, I suppose. Now it's I just thought it was interesting that they ended this episode where they did. Not because it doesn't feel incomplete, but because it does feel complete. We see a complete arc and now it's time to end the episode. But then when you like go back and you're like, well, is that the only time we see Bluegon? you know, is like he shows up at the beginning of an episode and then he gets trapped. Okay, I guess, you know, but we do learn some things about him. And so let's move on to lore. How's that for a segue? So, of course, we learn about three connected locations in this episode. We have Scimitar Summit, which is one of the peaks in the Crystal Range, right? So, Scimitar Summit is the top of a mountain, and I'm assuming the Crystal Range is a range of mountains, a mountain range, if you will. And then, of course, Kurtuk Pass leads to Scimitar Summit, right? So all of these locations are like connected and they're all kind of rare. Like it's not common to find a Scimitar Summit or a Kurtuk Pass scan. Now we also learn that, of course, Ramusa lives at the top of Scimitar Summit. That's his home. And of course, also, we learn that there are obstacles in Kurtuk Pass. There's zap pillars, there's falling rocks, there's a foggy abyss, there's a slide, right? Now, why are there booby traps, so to speak, in this shortcut? They don't explain that. But what's relevant is that they are there and they're there. What's relevant is they are there. That's what we learned, basically. Now, we also get another hint about Frafto. Maybe his occupation is border control, which I hate to phrase it that way, but Bluegon says that Frafto warned him that Perithion was coming. So instead of stopping him himself, I guess, like instead of Frafto stopping Perithion, he just like flew to Bluegon and was like, hey bro, somebody's coming for your one and only friend. And so I guess he did something, like I guess he fulfilled his role in some way. He's the sprinter at Marathon, warning Bluegon that Perithion is coming. And isn't that fun? Now, we also get lore about Ramusa and Perithion and they're bitter enemies. Bitter, bitter, bitter enemies. But like, in order to be bitter enemies, you have to have met before. Like, in order to have an enemy, you have to know them, right? Because otherwise, you're just like yelling at a wall and not being enemies with a person. So we learn that they've met before, they've fought before, and they've built this relationship that Ramusa and Perithion are enemies. And the thing is, before the invention of this snake mobile, they couldn't travel to each other. I'm assuming that's based on temperature reasons, right? Like Scimitar Summit is too cold and frigid, and like difficult to get to. Like Perithion would not have been able to make that journey independently. Like he would have been stopped ahead of time. And maybe the underworld is too hot for Ramusa. Who's to say? But or like there's no way that he would have made it there. So how have they met before and how have they battled? I don't like are they at the grocery store like, oh hey, maybe Ramusa took the last thing of eggs and Perithion's bitter, but they're bitter enemies. And so like calling them bitter enemies really has me intrigued because in order to have an enemy, you would have to had formed a relationship and you have to earn that status of enemy. But enemies is not just like a one-time thing, it's an ongoing relationship. So you're not just enemies with somebody that you wronged once. So, maybe he stole the eggs at the grocery store twice. But like it's a multiple instance thing and like because they can't go to where each other lives, how do they meet and why and where? Right? It just intrigues me and it's something about this like snake and we've seen Perithion before and we've seen him be devious and make a deal with Christella. We've seen Ramusa before. I'm pretty sure battling Rothar in the scavenger scan episode. Somebody check me on that. Right, and so like they both can go outside where they live, but how? Like how and why have they met? So, what are your thoughts on enemies? I think about Perry the Platypus and Doofenshmirtz. In Phineas and Ferb, they're essentially like an old married couple, right? By the end of the series, they like really have each other's backs, but that's because they have a relationship, but they're still enemies, right? They've earned that relationship of enemies, and like that was the one, and that example is a little more complicated because they do become more frenemies than pure enemies, but like it's a multiple instance thing. Anyways, we also get that Rhaemusa is Blugon's only friend, and so for the like 1 minute that Blugon shows up, we do get to characterize him a little bit as he's very isolated. He only has one friend, and he's like takes it very seriously that his interaction with Kaz isn't, the most smooth thing. And so we learn a little bit about Blugon, and we learn a little bit about Ramusa that he has a friend. So maybe Ramusa has more than one friend, but Blugon only has one. Now onto my fun fact and other notes section. Here's the thing. I have to talk about Elliot. First, I think Elliot gives us an interesting insight into a culture that goes on at Chaotic. He kind of represents this business where you trade cards, or like he kind of maybe represents a resale market. Now, we don't know what kind of payment he's accepting, or if it's just like he's a card trader, but his reputation as a reputable source of quality scans is really important to him. Like, wonderful. Quality scans. He has a slogan, and he's trying to like do advertisements in his Betadrome match. And so he kind of becomes a symbol for the resale market, if you will. But what you may not know is that Elliot's voice actor is 100% Andrew Reynolds. And you can't tell me that it's not Andrew Reynolds. So, I know. Let's talk about it. Here's the thing. How did I figure this out, and why should you care? Two questions I'm sure you're asking. Unless you know who that is, and then you're like, tee hee hee. But how did you figure it out? I think when I was watching it, um, like when it was posted on YouTube that first time, I figured it out because his voice sounded familiar to me, and so I looked it up, and boom, Andrew freaking Reynolds. You know what I mean? Crazy. And if you don't believe me, his name is in the credits, but for those of you unfamiliar, Andrew is a big Broadway star, and he's probably most well known for originating Elder Price in the Book of Mormon, but he's done other things. He's well known for the Falsettos revival, and the Tony performance of that was kind of memeified. I'm not going to get into that, but like, you surely can if you want. Recently, he was in a Gutenberg revival with Josh Gad, who, if you don't know who Josh Gad is, he's the voice of Olaf, LeFou, in Beauty and the Beast live action. He's in the Angry Birds movie. Um, another famous person, big theater person, who Josh Gad and Andrew Reynolds did Book of Mormon on Broadway together. So, like, it all comes full circle. And if you're not a big theater person, he also has TV credits and movie credits. I think the most recognizable thing that he's done would be the Prom movie. And maybe that's just because I'm a theater kid and the Prom is another musical. But, like, the Prom has Meryl Streep in it. So, if a movie has Meryl Streep in it, you know it's qualified as to be a movie. And so he knows Meryl Streep. And if you want to know my thoughts about the Prom movie, that's a different video. But here's the thing. It has Meryl Streep, and I don't think it's bad. I think it might be a little bit good. So, again, my thoughts on that's a different video. But Andrew Reynolds, What a Small World. Now, I believe that I like to have seen some interviews. I've seen some like mentions of like, is this actually Andrew Reynolds? And let's talk about that. Here's the thing. Here's what I know. I know he had an acting contract with 4Kids Entertainment, and he's done voices in like a variety of shows around this time for that company. And in the interview that I like just watched, like one more time recapping this, he does say that he doesn't remember being in Chaotic, but I think it's so easy for him to do one episode for one voice, right? Like, and here's the thing, he's credited. And on IMDb, he's credited for all 78 episodes, and me in my heart, I know that's not true. You know what I mean? Like, the additional voices are not in every single episode, but I think just so clearly this specific character is him. Like that's his voice. And of course it's pitched, of course it's more nasally, like he's doing a character voice, but just the timbre is so him and I think it's I just think it's recognizable. And like it's every other time I hear it. Sometimes I'm just so immersed in the story that that's just Elliot. But then every other time I'm like, "Hey Andrew, welcome to Chaotic." And so it's just something I have to point out is that to me, this is most definitely him, right? Even if it was after the time of his contract, he could have come in for like an hour and done these lines. So I don't think it's out of the question, and I think it just has to be him. It has to be him. It is him. And you know it, I know it, we all know it. That's my fun fact for this episode is that a big Broadway star is in Chaotic. And isn't that fun? Now, two other things I want to point out about this episode are one, both Elliot and Tom play with mixed decks in this episode, and that's interesting, that's fun, especially because using a mixed deck is like a strategy that's not presented as always the best option. They both do it, so I think that's interesting. Another thing is Tom is not being slick about trying to help Kaz in the Drome. Like when they were trying to help Maxor, they were being all secretive, like, you can't say interests or whatever. But in this episode, he like breaks the fourth wall and is like, "Hey Sarah, tell Kaz this." He's like yelling from the rooftops. And so I just think that's an interesting contrast. So those are my other notes. And before I get to my final thoughts, I also do have to recommend the movie Boys in the Band, which is another theater thing, like it's based on a play, but it's another thing Andrew Reynolds is in. But you should watch it like for the culture. Be cultured. You know what I mean? 9 out gay men in one movie. It's like, it's you should watch it. Now, on to my final thoughts is, a part of me is like, filler episode, but that's just because there's not a lot of information that we get from this episode. There's not a lot of overarching story that echoes throughout the rest of the show. Like, it's a very self-contained plot, but I can't help but love it because it's so clever and succinct and plot driven. And of course, the Broadway star cameo. Now, like, here's the thing. Is this episode the first episode that comes to mind when I think about Chaotic? No, not necessarily. But most of the time when I watch it, I like it. Now, ultimately, I don't like this episode every single time. Like, sometimes maybe it's annoying. Like, the trials, the the slide thing. I don't know. You know, but most of the time I watch this episode, I like it. And it has Andrew Reynolds, so you have to give it bonus points. And ultimately, I do like this fun. I think it's tight. I think it's fun. I think it's full of action. And what more could you want in a good time? This episode is so chaotic, it hurts. It doesn't hurt, but it's just so, I think, essential chaotic because it uses the medium and the forms and the layers just in a way that you can only do in the show. And for those reasons, I give this episode a good review. And with that, thank you so much for watching, for going on this journey with me. I'll see you next time. Bye.